The service corridor on the hospital's second level ran between the radiology wing and the staff break room, and it was used primarily by people who needed to be somewhere quickly without being seen, moving quickly, which in a hospital was a specific category of person at a specific kind of moment. Axis stopped at the junction where the corridor bent left without being directed to stop. He stood with the wait-forward stillness that Theo Kane had learned to read as distinct from alarm. Not a threat in front of them, but something in the sound ahead that required attention before they turned the corner. Theo stopped. He listened. Voices. One controlled, one not. The one that was not controlled belonged to a man who was making a specific kind of argument, not the loud public kind, but the compressed, close-in kind that happens when someone believes they have an audience of one and no one is coming. Theo turned the corner. A young woman in hospital scrubs was against the wall with her arm held at the wrist by a man in the kind of casual clothes that said he belonged here the way money says it belongs places. The man had not yet finished what he was saying. He did not know anyone was behind him. Axis moved between them with the deliberate, unhurried placement of a dog that has already completed its assessment, and the sound from his chest was the low, continuous register of a dog that is not asking questions. The man stopped speaking. He did not yet turn around. What Lieutenant Commander Theo Kane found when he walked the hallway that followed, through a hospital room on the third floor, a veteran's patient chart, and a director's office, had been accumulating in this institution for 2 years, and it needed someone to turn a corner before it could stop. If you haven't found this channel yet, subscribe. This is the kind of story we tell here. Theo Kane was 42 and had been retired from Naval Special Warfare for 16 months, and had been back in Memphis for 3 weeks, living in his father's house on East Parkway while he worked out whether he was going to stay or keep moving. His father, James Kane, had died 8 years ago of a cancer that his oncologist had noted in the documentation that mattered as likely attributable in part to Agent Orange exposure during James's service in Vietnam in 1967 and 1968 with the 101st Airborne Division. James had not talked about Vietnam with any particular regularity, which was its own kind of talking about it, and Theo had grown up understanding that his father carried something that had no name that fit and that had no bottom that could be reached, and had watched James carry it until the carrying was over. He had joined the Navy at 22 partly because his father had served and partly because he wanted to know what the carrying felt like from the inside, and had found, over 20 years and 4 deployments, that the carrying did not become lighter through familiarity, only more familiar. He was in Memphis now because Victor Crane was in the hospital, and Theo had visited Victor every other day for 2 weeks, because Victor was the last person on Earth who had known James Kane the way James had been before Vietnam made him the way he was, and Theo was not done with that yet. Axis was 6 years old, a Belgian Malinois, dark-coated with amber eyes, and he had been coming to the hospital with Theo on every visit because the facility's pet therapy program admitted registered service dogs to certain wards, and because Victor Crane had, on the first visit, put his hand on Axis's head and said, "Old soldier," with a specific combination of warmth and recognition that some elderly veterans use with military working dogs, as though the dogs understand something about service that doesn't require translation. Axis had understood. He had been lying beside Victor's bed for 2 weeks, accepting the appellation with the patient dignity it deserved. He was at Theo's side in the service corridor when he stopped at the junction, and he had already moved toward the corner before Theo had fully processed what his own ears had told him was wrong. Victor Crane had been 79 for 6 weeks and had been in this hospital for 10 days, which was 6 days longer than he had expected to be here. He had been admitted for a cardiac catheterization procedure that had gone well by the metrics that mattered to the procedural team, but that had been followed by 2 complication events that his attending physician had flagged for monitoring and investigation. He had run Crane Body Works on Lamar Avenue in Memphis for 31 years, had raised 3 children in the Berkeley neighborhood, had 7 grandchildren whose photographs were on the windowsill of his hospital room, with the careful arrangement of someone who has placed them with intention. He had been with the 101st Airborne in Vietnam, assigned to the same battalion as a young soldier named James Kane, had spent 2 years in country with the specific intimacy of men who have been in the same bad places at the same time, and had emerged from it with the specific kind of friendship that does not require much maintenance because it is built on something maintenance cannot improve, James had left Vietnam in 1969. Victor had left in 1970. They had talked on the phone at least once a month for 40 years. James Kane died in 2016. Victor had not stopped missing him. He had been having his medication administered by a rotating nursing staff that was in his 11 days of observation, consistently understaffed in ways that had produced 2 moments he had noted mentally but had not formally reported. On day 4 and day 7 of his stay, he had received doses that he was experienced enough with his own prescriptions to recognize were not his usual amounts. Both times, the nurse had been apologetic and distracted, and had moved on before Victor could ask the question properly. He was 79 and had a view of his situation that was simultaneously patient and precise. He was going to wait for the right moment to say what needed to be said, and when the right moment arrived, he was going to say it plainly. Dr. Priya Nair had been at this hospital for 18 months as an internal medicine resident and had been filing formal quality concerns for 7 of them, which her program director had described as diligent in the same tone that a person uses when they mean something adjacent. She was 28, from New Jersey, had ranked in the top 3 of her medical school class, and had come to this hospital specifically because it had a veteran services floor with a community reputation she had wanted to be part of. She had found a floor that was understaffed by a margin that the budget rationale explained, and the patient outcomes contradicted. She had filed 3 requests for a medication administration audit in the past month, citing specific chart discrepancies she had identified on the veterans floor. All 3 requests had been returned to her marked under administrative review. She had received, on 2 occasions, informal communication from the hospital's community board, specifically from a board member named Blake Harmon, asking her to allow the review process to proceed without additional escalation. She had considered the phrase additional escalation for approximately 2 days and had filed a 4th request through the hospital's external quality reporting channel, which had a different recipient address than the internal one. She had been documenting all of this. She had been heading to the break room after a 12-hour shift when Blake had appeared in the service corridor. Have you ever worked somewhere or known someone who filed a report that was filed away? Who said something that needed to be said and watched it disappear into a process that had been designed to make things disappear? Tell me about it below. I read everyone. Blake Harmon turned around. He turned with the specific recalibrating expression of a man who has been conducting a private situation and has discovered it is not private, and whose features are running through the available options: minimization, redirection, authority assertion, in rapid succession. He was 30, well-dressed, with the specific ease of someone who has occupied certain spaces for long enough to have stopped noticing them as spaces. He looked at Theo. He looked at Axis. He looked at the way Axis was positioned between Blake and Dr. Nair. Wait slightly forward, the low sound in the dog's chest that communicated without ambiguity that the assessment was complete. He said, "This is a private." Theo said, "Let go of her arm." His voice was the voice he used when the situation was clear and there was one thing that needed to happen, and everything else could wait. Blake looked at him for 1 second. He released Dr. Nair's wrist. She stepped to her left and put her back to the wall on the far side away from Blake, and looked at Theo with the specific expression of someone who has just been found by something they didn't know was coming. Theo said, "Are you hurt?" She said, "No." He looked at her arm. She would have a bruise. She would photograph it later because that was what you did when you knew how to document things, and she knew. Theo looked at Blake. Blake said, "I don't know who you think you are, but this facility has legal counsel, and whatever you think you saw, get out of this corridor." He said it in the same tone he had used the first time, and Blake looked at him for a long moment and then looked at Axis, who had not moved and whose eyes had not moved, and Blake made the correct assessment of the situation and left. Theo waited until the sound of his footsteps had gone to the elevator. He looked at Dr. Nair. He said, "I'm visiting a patient on 3. Victor Crane, you know him?" He said, "He's one of mine." He said, "What's going on with his care?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she took a breath and told him. They walked to the 3rd floor together, Axis between them, and Priya pulled Victor's chart at the nurse's station and showed Theo the medication log on days 4 and 7. The entries were there. The incident reports were not, she explained, the audit requests, and the administrative returns, and Blake's communications. She explained the staffing levels on the veterans floor versus the staffing ratios in the hospital's comparable medical surgical wards, which she had calculated herself, and which showed a 23% disparity. She had all of this in a folder in her locker. Victor was awake when they came in, the television off, which was how Victor spent his afternoons. He looked at Theo and at the woman in scrubs with the specific direct attention of a man who reads rooms. He said, "What happened?" Theo told him the outline. Victor listened without interrupting, which was the habit of a man who had learned that the interruption was usually a form of performing understanding rather than achieving it. Victor said, "She filed those reports." Priya said, "I know what happened on day 4. He looked at his hands on the blanket, the specific, unhurried stillness of someone who has been waiting for a moment and has recognized it arriving. "I was going to say something when the time was right." Theo said, "This might be the time." Victor said, "They're planning to discharge you in 3 days. The condition you're in, that's premature." Victor said, "Then, let's do it right." What Dr. Harmon said when he came to Victor's room 2 hours later, and what Victor said in return, was the end of 14 months of budget decisions that had never been reviewed for their effect on a specific ward, on a specific floor, where specific men had been receiving less than they deserved. If you were in Theo's position right now, with the chart, the audit requests, and 72 hours, what would your first call have been? Tell me below. I read every comment. Theo made 4 calls from the hospital parking garage. The first was to the Veterans Health Administration patient advocacy line, where he described the specific chart anomalies and the failed incident report filings. The second was to the Joint Commission's complaint intake, which was the accreditation body for the hospital and which took complaints of this specific category very seriously. The third was to a veterans' rights attorney in Nashville, whose name he had gotten from the advocacy organization before the call ended. The fourth was to a former teammate who had done a fellowship at the Department of Veterans Affairs and whose number Theo had memorized because that was how Theo stored the numbers that mattered. He came back to Victor's room and told Priya who he had called. She looked at her folder and added the names and reference numbers to her documentation with the methodical calm of a physician who has been documenting things for 7 months and has not stopped. She called her program director. She called the external quality reporting channel to confirm receipt of her 4th submission. Dr. Robert Harmon arrived at 5:15 with 2 members of hospital security and his legal counsel. He was 58, silver-haired, with the practiced composure of a man who has managed institutional crises before and has developed a specific way of entering rooms. He came into Victor's room and looked at Theo, then at Priya, then at the attorney who had arrived 11 minutes before him, and who was now standing beside Priya with her briefcase on the windowsill. He said that the hospital took quality concerns very seriously and had an established process for their review. He said that the events of the afternoon in the service corridor had been reported to him and that he was committed to ensuring all parties were treated fairly. He said that the hospital's Veterans Services floor was one of its most valued programs and received consistent high-quality support from administration. Axis rose from beside Victor's bed. He rose without hurry, and the sound from his chest was the low, even, continuous note of a dog that has been in this room for 2 weeks and has specific opinions about what is true. He placed himself between Dr. Harmon and Victor's bed without being directed, and his eyes on Harmon did not shift. Victor said they gave me the wrong dose twice. He said it to the window, to the 7 photographs on the windowsill and the Memphis evening visible through the glass. He said it the way he said everything, plainly as a fact, in the patient voice of a man who has been waiting for the right moment and has recognized it. Day 4 and day 7, he said. I noted the dates. The nurse both times was someone who looked like she hadn't slept. Both times she moved on before I could ask her to check it again. The security officers were looking at the floor. Harmon said, I'm not in a position to comment on individual patient. The attorney said, the medication log entries are documented in Mr. Crane's chart. The absence of corresponding incident reports is also documented. The Joint Commission complaint was filed 37 minutes ago. Harmon looked at the chart in his counsel's hands. Theo spoke. He spoke in the flat, factual register of a man who has spent 20 years in environments where the quality of information directly affected outcomes. and who had no patience for information that was arranged for effect rather than accuracy. He said that the staffing levels on the veterans floor for the preceding 14 months, compared to the facility's comparable surgical wards, showed a disparity that had been calculated and documented. He said that 4 medication audit requests filed by the attending physician over the past 7 weeks had been returned marked under review without assignment to a named reviewer or response timeline. He said that a board member without medical credentials had physically confronted the attending physician in a service corridor this afternoon while advocating against the audit requests, which was documented on the hospital's own security camera footage, which the attorney had already submitted a preservation request for. He described the sequence. He did not comment on it. Harmon's composed expression was still composed, but the composition was doing more work than it had been doing when he entered the room. The attorney said, "We can discuss the specific remedies, or we can continue this conversation after the Joint Commission opens its inquiry. Either approach has a different timeline." Axis did not move until Harmon and his security officers and his counsel had left the room. He tracked the door after it closed. Then he walked back to Victor's bedside and lay down. Victor put his hand on the dog's back. He said, "James would have liked you." Theo said, "He would have liked Axis more." Victor said, "Probably." He looked at the photographs. James never did have much patience for people who needed 3 people to walk into a room. Theo said, "Neither do you." Victor said, "Neither do I." He was quiet for a moment. "Neither do you." Victor Crane's discharge was delayed by 5 days pending a medical review that his attending physician, Dr. Priya Nair, who filed the review request the following morning, determined was clinically indicated. By the end of the 5 days, his recovery indicators were where they should have been 4 days earlier. His cardiologist noted in the discharge summary that the extended monitoring had been appropriate. The Joint Commission opened a formal inquiry within 2 weeks. The inquiry found the staffing disparity on the veterans floor to be significant and issued a requirement for a corrective action plan within 60 days. The medication administration protocol for the floor was suspended pending a review that resulted in a new checklist process and the reopening of both incident reports, which were logged retroactively with the dates Victor had named. Blake Harmon resigned from the hospital's community board before the security camera footage preservation request was formally responded to, which was the kind of timing that answers its own question. Dr. Priya Nair received a formal acknowledgement of her 4 audit requests from the Joint Commission reviewer, who noted that her documentation had been materially useful to the inquiry, which was phrasing that the reviewer had clearly measured. She came back to the hospital the morning after Harmon's visit and did her rounds and ordered Victor's additional monitoring and went home and slept for 9 hours, which was the first time in 3 weeks she had done that. Victor went home on a Friday. His daughter picked him up. Theo and Axis were there when the discharge paperwork was signed. Victor, in the wheelchair the hospital required for discharge, looked at Axis. He said, "Old soldier." Axis's tail moved once. Victor looked at Theo. He said, "James was proud of you. He told me, the last time I talked to him, he said you were the kind of man who turned the right corners." He paused. "I didn't know what he meant then." He said, "I think I'm starting to understand it." They sat outside in the March sun while Victor's daughter brought the car. Memphis in March had the specific quality of a city deciding to open back up after a long winter. Still cool, but with light that had changed character. The kind of light that suggests things are about to proceed. Axis put his head in Victor's lap in the wheelchair. Victor's hand came down on the back of his head. He stayed there until the car arrived. What Theo Kane had done was turn a corner in a hospital corridor because his dog had stopped. He had not planned to become involved in a medication audit or a Joint Commission inquiry or the career of a hospital director's son. He had planned to visit an old man who had known his father. He had found, as sometimes happens, that showing up for one thing leads to showing up for a number of things that were waiting. He had come to see Victor. He had stayed to protect him. These had turned out to be the same thing. This story is for every patient on a ward somewhere who has received something that wasn't right and didn't know how to name it, for every doctor who filed a report that was filed away, and for every person who turned a corner they could have walked past. Is there someone in your life whose care you've been trusting to a system, a parent, a veteran, someone in a facility, without checking? This might be the week to check. Tell me about them in the comments. I read every one. Every story on this channel is about choosing not to look away. If that means something to you, subscribe so you're here for the next one. Which moment in this story stayed with you? I'll see you in the comments.